that every good boy deserves, fuck it, you get nothing. Section 1. Unlike my sister, who had a real love and talent for music, I took piano lessons because our teacher, Miss Street, had cable television. While my sister sat twice a week mastering the proper fingering to play sheet music without cartoon characters peering through the treble clef staff, I sat in the parlor room, the faint smell of mothballs and linseed oil, my legs up on a paisley ottoman, watching Gilligan's Island on Nickelodeon, and dutifully copying the answers from my sister's old piano theory books into my own. It was a ruse Miss Street would dispatch with in the first minute of our lesson by pointing to a middle C half note, the first note on the page, and asking 2 questions. Question 1, what note is this? Answer, F. Miss Street, how long do you hold the note for? B. 5? Half the time I answered wrong to egg her on, and the other half I honestly did not know, but wanted to interrupt the indomitable ticking of the metronome, or simply to stop staring at her withered, veiny finger, the color and fragility it seemed of a Vienna sausage, the cheapest kind to give even Mozart heartburn. Whatever my answer, Miss Street would grab my practice book, a quarter-sheet-sized notebook with page after page of empty musical bars, and scribble some castigating remark that my parents would repeat to me later over dinner in sad, disappointed tones. Once my ineptitude had been documented in light pencil, then and only then did she raise the fall board on the piano to reveal the keys. She had a baby grand in her front room salon and an upright in the corner. I was permitted access to only the upright. When neither were being played, the room was deafeningly silent. We'd spend the rest of the half hour suffering through some terrible rendition of a song called My Clever Pup, and she'd tisk at me between metronomic ticks before stopping me and having a frank conversation about my generic lack of desire and serious commitment, and the hours of practice it would take for me to approach the instrument with, she surmised, adequacy. I was 7 years old. Sometimes she would shake her head in an effort to blanket me in an old woman's shame. Sometimes she would ask, had I heard my sister play, in an attempt to make me jealous. I nodded or shook my head depending on how I felt like playing her that day, a miniature Teflon maestro sitting on the piano bench with untied sneakers. In truth, all I could think about was where my sister sat during my lesson. Cozy in the television parlor, the warm glow of Miss Street's enormous set lulling her to sleep, as she clutched the remote control with perfect form. Imagine your fingers holding an invisible tennis ball as the second half hour of some 1960s rerun ran onward, the 4 o'clock airing that I had no chance of seeing at home, where we only had network TV and the odd UHF channel when the weather wasn't crap, which it always was. Had there been some intervention, had some good-natured pedestrian or a roving ombudsman been walking his Dalmatian outside and stepped through the giant picture book window of her piano salon room and taken both Miss Street and me by the hand, we would have agreed that piano was not in my future. The little talent I had was a good ear, and maybe after some intense TV watching, I would have agreed to quit in exchange for her granting my only true wish, to play somehow, against all odds, the Scott Joplin rag, The Entertainer. Play it. I'd sometimes beg Miss Street halfway through a failed lesson. In a weak moment, she might oblige me, if only to hear a joyous noise come from the depths of the soundboard instead of the feeble tinklings I produced. And as those old hands danced through the jaunty melody, I would listen and watch, and then would do my damnedest to imitate her, hunting and pecking for a note that I could hear in my head, but never find on the keyboard. Joplin is a sophisticated piece, she would tell me, much too difficult for you if you don't practice. Then we'd return to the canon of songs I was doomed to fail to master, Big Ben, or Lil Pup, or The Old Shoe. If you were bad at piano, this was the grist. Song after song with lame cartoon illustrations and the word Lil, Ol, or Pup in the title. Mrs. Street's sausage finger pointed onward to my destiny. There would be no Joplin. For me, it was 3 chords, in a whimper. At the end of every lesson, Miss Street would take my small red practice notebook in her shaky hands and record my progress, little, give assignments, practice, 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 and then, with a paucity of her 80-year-old saliva, showing a modest bit of tongue, scandal, then lick and affix a small stamp in the corner of the page that read either good, very good, or excellent. An overall rating of the day's work, and to be honest, her opinion of me as a human being. My sister's book was plastered with excellent stamps, a gray square with red-rimmed lightning bolts in the corners. If you filled a book with these lightning bolts, not only did you get the satisfaction of Miss Street's smile, sometimes she would even laugh, an airy, ebullient trill, bottled it seemed from the Victorian age, perhaps even with a hint of ether, though I only heard it from afar on my couch marooned with Gilligan. But also, a pupil could select the cream-colored bust of a piano maestro from ages past. Handel, Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, Schubert, Haydn. Each composer's head had been shrunken to the size of a man's fist. Had I learned in a plot taken from Gilligan's mind that a witch doctor had cast a spell to freeze these masters in some intense moment of composition, the exact moment of ecstasy when inspiration had just struck, I wouldn't have been surprised. Mostly, though, I thought they looked like they had to take a bowel movement. As far as I was concerned, the jury was still out. All I knew was that I wasn't getting one. Luckily for me, the lowest stamp one could earn was a good rating. Perhaps when they printed the rows of goods, the music supply company had envisioned me dourly slumped on the bench, pecking out a feckless tune. They had mercy and the capacity to imagine lives lazier than their own. But in the grizzled dead eyes of those creamy busts my sister carried home monthly, lining them across her bookshelf, I recognized the glower those dead tinklers paid to mediocrity. It was the same look Miss Street gave to me at the end of every lesson, when from time to time she would hand my book back to me with no stamp in it at all. This is called the gallbladder. One Sunday dinner, my father announced he'd be having his gallbladder removed the next week. I was in college then, home for the weekend to study for my last final exams. We had what we affectionately called the chronic for dinner, named after its routine presence on my mother's weekly menu. Baked chicken, rice-a-roni, jellied cranberry, and recently frozen mixed vegetables. I just figured you all should know, my father said. He burped and cringed. My mother put down her fork and stared at him. What? She said, though it really wasn't a question. You've all seen me grabbing my side, he said, as if facts were enough to win the argument. Surgery, she said. And you didn't think to tell us. Us included my two sisters and myself, who weren't too thrown off by the announcement since we weren't going to bed every night with the man. We all pushed the vermicelli around the plates and quickly decided to help bust the table. It's outpatient, my father said. He was using a mock conciliatory tone, the same one I had learned to use with my mother when I was really in it deep. It was having about the same success. How will you drive home, she asked. I was going to call a cab, he said. I saw him smile a little, but my mother had moved past absurdity and into seething, tight-lipped Irish rage that only permitted short bursts of exclamations, ideally designed for the vulgar lexicon of her ancestral homeland. But my mother never had the swearing gene. A cab, she said. What if something goes wrong? It takes less than an hour, he said. What could go wrong? My mother cleaned her plate, raking the fork against the ceramic. I'm driving you, she said. I won't have you leaving the hospital like some vagabond. You make a big deal out of nothing, my father said. As a pairing, my parents are pretty well suited. My father is a consistent downgrader of most calamities, while my mother is the classic overestimator of life's bouquet of misery. Had it presented them as some kind of foreign pain in my side, my father would have told me he'd seen worse, and my mother would have been warming up the ambulance to drive me to Grant Hospital. The truth I learned much later was always somewhere in the middle. But we had all seen my father burping and cringing with a hand to his right side like he'd been pecked by a goose under his rib. My father poo-pooed most stomach ailments with regularity by nature. As my mother chomped on Tums or wiped off the pink mustache from a shot of Pepto-Bismol, he flapped his hand. Never had heartburn in my life. Often he'd boast of wild tales of travel at sea, where whole crews had come down with seasickness that he somehow avoided. I just stepped outside and got a big snootful of salt air and was fine. I didn't see what all this vomiting was all about. His lone weakness was stomach-wise had been from migraines, and even then he'd just have the dry heaves and not a full-bore projectile stream like my mother and sisters. The classic iron stomach matched with an iron resolve, a peerless calm in the face of calamity, especially it seemed when it came to bodily fluids. Once he tried slicing a stack of frozen hamburgers apart with a chef's knife and missed the seam of the burger only to find the webbing of skin between his thumb and forefinger. He must have nicked an artery because the blood looped out of the wound. My mother screamed and I got woozy watching the red arc streak across the wall. But my father took a paper towel, applied pressure to his hand, and raised the hand above his head to slow the bleeding. If it had been me, I would have run all over the house, super soaking the entire downstairs with a couple pints of AB positive before succumbing to exhaustion, leaving the kitchen looking like the Manson clubhouse. But my father remained Boy Scout calm. I think he might have even wiped up the blood that day before driving himself to the ER, where, once inside, he gave a quick pep talk to the doctor who was having trouble finding the artery to suture. "Are you a praying man, Doc?" It worked. So standing in the kitchen again, the same kitchen he had baptized with that wound years earlier, I was less worried about the gallbladder than my mother, maybe slightly more than my father. "You know what I told the doctor?" he said, smiling. I said to him, "Doctor, after surgery, do you think I'll be able to play the piano?" "Sure," the doctor said. "I don't see why not." So I say to him, "That's great because I always wanted to learn." The doctor just looked at me and said, "I can't believe I fell for that line." "It's not a joke," my mother said. She gave him a look that told us the whole conversation was going to be rediscussed later, this time without a vaudeville accompaniment. This one's called Views of My Father's Piano Breaking. I have a memory that plays back in my head. I write down parts, scraps of notes, details from this one night as a child, perhaps when I was 5 or 6. I write about it in classes, during exercises, after waking from dreams. Perhaps a smell triggers it, the scent of sun-bleached vinyl mixed with cigarette smoke, or a sound, the Sheena Easton song, "My Baby Takes the Morning Train." It is the space between the metronomic talks, the moment that cleared the way for piano lessons with Miss Street, my parents' desperate attempts to give culture to their children wasting away in the tornadic hinterlands of Ohio. It goes a little something like this. The first piano my father bought was an upright he found for sale in the used instrument classifieds in the Xenia Daily Gazette, our paper of little to no record. We were still saving for the second nickel to rub against the first, so my guess is the piano was free. Something the advertiser thought too heavy to move, or perhaps even some dalliance from a rich aunt kept in a parlor that had recently held her wake's reception. What I do remember is that somewhere in the ad the phrase, "pickup only," appeared. We only had one car then, a 1980 Dodge Aspen that we called the Bomb, but not in the way people say that phrase now. We meant it in the 1980 Cold War Brezhnev banging a shoe on the table nuclear winter wedding. It was only a few years old, but it was already decrepit as soon as it left the factory in Hamtramck. In the Plymouth version, it was dubbed the Volare, as in, "I will fly," the future tense being the most appropriate, as many didn't even start when they first rolled off the plant line. Picture the car that falls from a cliff in a 1970s B-movie and explodes. This was our car. It was as if Dodge had forced someone with no artistic skill to draw a car and took the design and did not run with it. What emerged was a car-shaped car. They offered it mostly in shades of the Rust family for the sake of continuity. From rust you came, and to rust you shall return. Not so much prophecy as guarantee, given the shoddy paint job and the bubbling on the seams of its fake oaken door panels. The Aspen offered some other amenities not listed in the owner's manual when it got cold. Instead of heat, it often blew in a melange of lukewarm exhaust and frigid air through the vents, which gave the driver and passenger a slight sense of euphoria and more than likely a lower IQ. In any weather below 40 degrees, the passenger side door never latched fully, which meant either my sister or I had to ride shotgun to hold it shut before it would swing wide and jam the hinge with a low creak, transforming the car from a mere station wagon into a wobbling, exhaust-spewing sledge, reaping clear any cars, bikers, or pedestrians who found themselves on the left side of the vehicle. Sometimes when it was my turn to sit up front, my sister and I always fought for the privilege to be thrown out of the car first. I'd play a game where I let the door pull open just until I caught a crack of gray slush below, maybe even felt its salted splash on my hand as my mother screamed to shut it tight again. I was about 5 or 6. I think about this car a lot when my wife is panicked about the recall of her kids' car seats for failing a crash test in lab conditions. In the front bench seat of the bomb, I'm not even sure I wore a seatbelt. What I do know is that no piano would fit inside of the hatchback. What we needed was a flatbed or a pickup truck. We lived in a rural town, jammed with hillbillies and GM Delco workers. Trucks were easy to come by for most people, but my parents were transplants from New York City. My father taught deaf children in a special ed school in nearby Dayton, while my mother translated tax documents from French into English for H&R Block. They didn't have many townie friends. Their one commonality was church. Some of the hillbillies were Catholic like us, and I'm sure that's how we ended up one night standing on a hillbilly porch in a hillbilly house at the bottom of a hill, watching hillbillies loading the upright piano into a red pickup truck. All I recall was that the piano had handles on the back of it to grab, and that it was night and that my father was excited. It must have been late summer, early fall, so the Aspen's doors would have held us all snugly in place on the front bench seat thanks to the Ohio humidity. The men, they must have been younger, in their 20s, so too was my father, though it's hard to imagine him as younger than I am now. They had a plywood loading ramp hooked onto the back of the truck, or maybe they didn't. They hefted it up onto the flatbed one end at a time, the noise it made going in. It scraped the hell out of the finish, but who cared as long as the guts were intact? It was all out of tune. My father tinkling a key or two, maybe it was one of the men who played. At some point in the memory, my father stands alone, unreasonably happy, a wide-mouthed grin, the same one he gave to me when he did the poison check on a Dairy Queen cone, removing a half dome of chocolate in an instant. There he stood staring up the hill at the trip back to Virginia Drive as the boys, not men now, secured the upright to the gunnels of the truck with rope. But they went too slow up the hill. Odd for young kids. But maybe they knew to ignore their testosterone-fueled instincts and gun it. Maybe the Aspen was the pace car. It had failed on hills before. But gunning it is what they should have done. Instead, the piano slid back with each slow revolution of their wheels. They gave it just enough gas and time for one end of the upright to get down low and plunk over, throwing the whole instrument off balance and onto the pavement. It must have looked something like a Tom and Jerry cartoon. The cloud of smoke and ivory rumbling down the hill, crushing and crashing its way back to where it began in a rumbled mess of wire, wood, and ebony. What I knew then, looking at the rubble, was we could have never taken the piano home as an upright, but there in pieces, it would have fit just fine in the hatch of the Aspen. I don't remember who cleaned it up or the forlorn look on the boy's face as he craned his neck out the window. I don't remember my father's hands at his side standing over the instrument, shaking his head. We drove back home. Perhaps I fell asleep in the car and wet the seat. I was a notorious bed pisser then, and wherever I fell asleep became my bed, either car seat, couch, or human. Of that I'm almost sure. What is certain is that all that remains of that piano is the memory I have of it, what I wrote on the page of a notebook one morning 30 years later and shared with my father one night on the phone. It's very descriptive, he said after listening. The only problem is that your memory never happened. 4. is the last section here. My father's drive 30 years later. No, you weren't there, he said to me on the phone. I was by myself. You were a little boy, maybe 5 or 6. I couldn't have taken you. It was early morning. We both knew why I wouldn't have been conscripted. Most likely not because I was little, but more so because at that hour, I would have been rubbing the crud from my eyes and re-emerging to consciousness from a long winter sleep, where for pretty much the entire night, I peed and peed and peed and peed. No one can piss a bed like me did. From headboard to footboard, not an inch of sheet was left unpissed. Half the time you go in there in the middle of the night and you'd already be floating, my father would tell me. My parents weren't mean about it. Small bladders ran in the family. Each of them had a sibling who went to bed into their late teens, so when I stopped at age 9, it was like they got off easy. But I knew why my father wasn't game to have me ride shotgun early on that Saturday to get a piano, when it would have taken me a 15-minute soak to get the stink off. If time machines existed and I could go back and join my father, what I would have found might have looked something like this. A bitter cold morning, achingly clear, sky the color of the ocean on a pull-down map at school. I was sitting at home, more than likely on a mottled carpet, deep green, the color of well-watered shrubs. The carpet itself was indeed shrubby and tough. They bought it to dissuade our half-wit head-case dog Cricket from pooping on it when the doorbell rang and we weren't there. It didn't work. Looking back, I guess my parents had a soft spot for incontinence in their children and pets. Cricket loved me stinky, so there I sat, very possibly not bathed, stroking her belly and yawning, still sleepy from a long night of pissing, waiting for the cartoon version of the Lone Ranger to come on. Once the first bars of the William Tell Overture sounded, I'd bound down the hall to my room and drag out my wooden rocking horse, pulling it from in front of the television, and still wet, throw a leg over my urine-tanned saddle, and put my feet on the pegs to whip my steed alive, hi-ho silver with a B, away. All that to say, I don't hold a grudge against my dad. I would have left young, pissy-smelling me behind as well. As I rocked in my fantasy adventure, there my father sat, riding solo in the aspen, stoic, almost Kimosabe-like, minus the hair, on his quest to get this upright piano from, I don't remember them really, he said. Who knows, probably hillbillies, but they were nice. Hey, free piano, right? The leaving part of the trip is never important. It's the coming back that concerns us. They got the piano in a flatbed of an old pickup truck and lashed it to the gunnels. My father led the caravan back to the house from one side of Xenia to the other. The main test for our fearsome warriors of the Midwestern Plain, the apex of a hill that guarded the IGA supermarket we frequented, Holsey's, spelled out in white blocks with red letters across the low beige rectangle, a steep incline. My father crept up that hill as if he were searching for a parking spot in the Holsey's lot and not driving on the country highway in front of it. Up they crept, my father glued to his rear view the whole time. The kids in the truck, excited by the task, the slow ritualistic procession of it all, giving him the okay sign perhaps, and this would have made him laugh as a teacher of the deaf, because to all his students that sign only meant one thing: asshole. Onward they climbed, my father and the assholes, crossing the highest point in the steep decline, the aspen's brakes holding, the piano sliding imperceptibly closer to the cab window, perhaps even an atonal cry issued forth from the tied-down beast, answered by the downshift of the truck, and they were down on the level road again, a half-mile to go. Now my father gave them the thumbs up because they were entering Arrowhead, a subdivision flattened by wind, a grid of streets all named for dead presidents and states, meteorological catastrophe. They passed McKinley Elementary, its half-moon concrete tornado shelter peeking up above the football field, and he, my father, not William, must have been humming a tune then, perhaps one he'd be able to poke out later on the keyboard. The point being, he had stopped looking backward and into the forward-gazing window of the future of his life with upright piano, wife, kids, and half-wit dog. There was only one turn left from McKinley onto our street, Virginia Drive, 20 houses down the block on the right. The driveway was a little steep, but they could park on the side and back it up onto the yard and deposit it into the house if they had to. Yes, into our green and yellow house with the green and yellow bowls, chartreuse really, as only the late 70s could love, in which right then I would have been eating cereal, honey nuts, still in my pissed PJs, with the cliff maroon ibexes on the front of them. Please stop pissing on us, Patrick. Gazing at the screen from the rocking horse, or maybe even on the couch with Cricket next to me, panting, always shaking, always nervous. Could she see it coming? The final fateful turn that the flatbed was about to make? Perhaps it was only fear that made her shake. Fear of the space the upright would take up into an already small family room. All that echoing, all that tinkling, would it drown out the interminable bass, thumping from the Wilberforce college kids who lived down the block, or the wretched burr of angle grinding from the neighbor who worked all day at the Delco plant and spent all night building his own hot rod on the pristine concrete altar in his garage. Who among us would plumb the depths of a very dumb dog's thoughts? Beyond time to shit and time to eat and time to shake, Cricket hadn't given us many glimpses of her cognitive leaps, and this time was no exception. But my father now on the phone, in his pause, I could hear his dream in the silent static of the line. Teaching the deaf all day, he would demand orderly sound to come from that wooden box of strings. It had to be sated, that need. It would be sated by us. This was the kids' piano, after all. We would be his entertainers. So sure was he that one of us would have a talent for it that he didn't look back at all on the final turn and see the truck take the corner too fast. Around 7 a.m. on that day, the air crystalline with frost, the sound of the crash carrying for miles. Oh, Kimosabi, oh life. The neighbors were pulling out shards of ivory from their tires for weeks.